Today is July 27th, 2020. I'm Tom. I'm here with Tony. What is consciousness? Is consciousness the same as the brain? Or is consciousness something categorically distinct from the brain?
Many would define consciousness as almost like the movie that is being played by the projector, which is the brain. In other words, the brain is the engine, and its mechanics, like the neurons and everything else, create consciousness. And the consciousness dies when the brain stops functioning. Just like when a projector stops working, the movie disappears.
Okay, but how does the process of creating consciousness work? Because I never would have expected that to happen. I never would have expected the physical functioning of the human brain to produce something like consciousness. Consciousness seems so specific and personal and strange. Thousands or millions or billions of neurons firing and functioning in a certain way. How does that produce my experience of walking through a garden and I see all the colorful flowers and I smell all the rosy scents and the flowery aromas, and it's like this physical experience. I have all these sensations and I can feel the sun beating down on my skin. It's such a real phenomenon to experience something. I have no idea how the brain can produce something like consciousness.
So the brain would technically be like this engine you could think of. No one really knows how it creates consciousness. We're trying to reproduce it as we speak. Scientists are trying to.
The physical details of any other process in the body, whether it's the processes of the heart, or the processes of the lungs, or the processes happening in your legs, that's all just physical functioning. And there's no metaphysical aspect of that. That's just physical stuff happening. That's described by physics and it's described by biology. But when you get to consciousness, that seems to enter into the realm of metaphysics, because we're not just talking about the physics of particles, we're not just talking about the biology of neurons, we also have to start talking about the phenomenon of conscious experience. To explain that is a kind of explanation that we've never accomplished before in all of science.
Indeed, psychology does deal with the different neurons and different chemicals within the brain, but I don't think it comes close to even defining really what consciousness is. It more deals with the problems with the neurological imbalances within the brain. Nothing really comes close to just dealing with the actual definition of consciousness.
This is David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, which is the question, how does physical functioning in the brain produce the phenomenon of conscious experience? How do you get from physical materials to mental phenomena? This is a mystery, but a lot of scientists think that consciousness is simply the brain functioning, and it's really no different than any other physical process, like photosynthesis in a plant, or the processes that the heart conducts, or the processes that your stomach conducts. They think consciousness is just a brain process in the same way that all those other physical processes are simply physical processes. I disagree. I think what consciousness is, if you actually think carefully about what conscious experience is, you'll realize that the smell of peanut butter or the sight of a green meadow, those conscious experiences don't seem to have anything to do with the physical brain in your head that's creating those experiences. So the question of how does consciousness relate specifically to the physical brain functioning that generates it, that's the million-dollar question here. Because it must. Consciousness must simply be the brain functioning in a specific way.
I don't think we have an explanation for that yet. However, it is safe to assume that there is certainly a connection between the brain's functioning and consciousness, and at the same time, I mean, other people can differentiate that between saying, oh, well, there's no consciousness, it's just like just the spirit or the soul So that gets more into the problem of, well, okay, so consciousness is part of the soul, or it is like the human spirit, and it goes into heaven. That problem occurs then saying that consciousness can be linked anywhere to the brain. Then it's not linked to the brain at all. It's linked as an abstract entity inside of us. In other words, like we are technically a robot and it's controlling us. That would be completely different, but I think while people argue that, I think that that's problematic to link it to the brain then, because if the brain shuts off when you die, certainly therefore it would make it harder to prove that it, continues on after we die. If you're going to say that the consciousness is directly linked to the brain, then it must be stated that when you die, the consciousness dies with you.
And when someone puts me under anesthesia, I no longer have consciousness.
Well, that's interesting, because then you could say, well, you can lose consciousness to a certain extent, but then you get it back and you're not dead. So therefore, you could say consciousness doesn't have to exist for the human to be alive, but the human needs to be alive for consciousness to exist. So consciousness is sentience of awareness of internal or external existence. So when we sleep, do we lose consciousness? I think we do.
Well, we're conscious when we dream.
Are we, though?
Yes.
Really?
You experience your dreams.
You experience your dreams, but is it really an awareness of internal or external existence?
A dream would be awareness of your internal brain functioning, as opposed to, when you're awake, you're seeing and hearing your surroundings.
Is consciousness then the awareness of the mind in itself and its relationship to the world? Because if it is, are people with severe mental illness, do they really have consciousness? People who hallucinate and don't really understand reality, who can't understand reality, seeing things outside of our reality, are they really conscious?
Yeah. You don't have to be understanding reality accurately to be conscious. I'd say consciousness is just sentience in the first place.
But here's the question to that. Then is a dog sentient?
Yes.
Is a plant sentient?
No.
Why not?
Because a plant doesn't have a brain. I think only animals with brains are conscious.
They all have a consciousness.
I think any organism with a brain has consciousness.
So what changes that from a dog or a cat to a human?
Because a human's brain is different than a dog's brain. A human has different kinds of experiences than a dog has. A human has much more advanced cognition than a dog has. Because the dog's brain is like it's like a different software. It's a different system that doesn't allow for thinking about general relativity and cosmology and metaphysics and mathematics. But a dog still has consciousness. A dog still sees things and hears things and feels emotions and has some thoughts. It just doesn't have as advanced thoughts as a human.
You think it has thoughts and it can feel pain and everything else?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then it's conscious, so all conscious beings. What makes us different then? A higher level of consciousness?
Well, a higher level of understanding. A higher level of comprehension of the world around us. It's like a 3-year-old has some understanding of the world around him or her, but the 3-year-old can't understand advanced physics or advanced math. It would struggle to understand the conversation we're having right now. I think the awkwardness of consciousness is that we always think of the universe from the third-person point of view. When physicists speak about astronomy or cosmology or quantum mechanics, they're talking about the universe from a bird's-eye point of view. But when we start talking about consciousness, we're trying to blend that third-person scientific perspective with the first-person inner subjective conscious perspective of what it's like to be a human being. And those two perspectives must be compatible, because consciousness is a phenomenon that happens in our brains, and our brains are in the universe. But it's just awkward to sort of switch from that third person point of view to the first person point of view. It almost seems like when we're talking about consciousness, we're not really talking scientifically anymore. But I think we are. It's just we've yet to understand how the physics of particles in the brain can give rise to something like consciousness.